Strip her of that rank and take her badge off now." That roar from my SEAL Admiral silenced the entire field. Every soldier froze, every breath stopped, and the sun itself seemed to burn heavier on my uniform. My medals felt like they were melting under the weight of humiliation. I stood there, eyes forward, heart breaking beneath the surface, because the man who once called me the finest officer he'd ever trained was now screaming for my downfall. The same voice that once whispered tactical wisdom in briefing rooms was now thundering my disgrace across training grounds where hundreds could witness my destruction. But what he didn't know was that destiny had already written a new order, one he'd be forced to salute. The same system he thought he commanded was already measuring his fall while he celebrated mine. The next morning, while I packed in silence, 2 letters arrived. The first said, "Commander, please read the Admiral's dismissal notice." The second carried something colder, a truth that would end his career forever. Before I open that letter with you, this isn't just a story about rank. It's about what happens when humiliation meets justice. It's about the rhythm of power and how the loudest voices often echo the shortest. I wasn't born with connections or family names. I earned my uniform the way real soldiers do, through scars, through sweat, through silence. Every stripe on my sleeve was paid for in blood and discipline. Every medal pinned to my chest came with nights of doubt and mornings of determination. Admiral Cole, that's the man who shaped my tactical mind. For 7 years, he was more than my commanding officer. He was my mentor, my guide through the labyrinth of military strategy and leadership. He used to say I reminded him of the kind of soldier the Navy used to build. Strong, unbreakable, committed to the mission above all else. Those words felt like benediction back then. When he spoke them, I believed I was becoming something worthy, something that honored the uniform I wore and the country I served. He taught me to read battlefield chaos like sheet music, to find patterns in enemy movements that others missed. Under his guidance, I developed an instinct for tactical decisions that saved lives and completed missions when others would have failed. But admiration has a way of curdling into something poisonous. What started as respect for my capabilities slowly transformed into fear of my independence. I began to represent what he could no longer control, leadership that didn't require his permission to breathe. My respect among the ranks grew louder than his authority, and that sound terrified him. The breaking point came during Operation Sandstorm. We were planning a high-stakes extraction in hostile territory, and the Admiral's tactical approach had a fatal flaw, a blind spot that would expose our team to enemy fire for 37 seconds longer than necessary. 37 seconds that could mean the difference between bringing our people home and shipping them back in boxes. I questioned it. Not with disrespect, not with insubordination, but with the cold logic he'd taught me to use. I presented alternative approaches, showed him the tactical vulnerabilities in his plan, offered solutions that would protect our soldiers while accomplishing the same objective. He called it insubordination. I called it survival. My report went up the chain of command anyway. It saved lives, but it exposed his arrogance to superiors who'd started questioning his judgment. The mission succeeded with modifications based on my recommendations, and that success became a humiliation he couldn't forgive. That's when the slow poisoning began. He started removing me from briefings where my expertise was needed. My name disappeared from recommendation letters for promotions I'd earned. Critical intelligence that should have reached me was delayed or filtered through other officers. He began freezing me out of the very system I'd helped build. The rumors started then, whispers that I was too emotional to lead, that I couldn't handle the pressure of real command, that my gender made me unsuitable for the harsh realities of military decision-making. Poison dripped from his tongue into the ears of anyone who would listen, painting my competence as weakness and my independence as instability. Yet my unit stood by me, quietly, fiercely loyal. They knew what I was capable of because they'd seen it in action. They'd followed me through firefights and complex operations where my decisions kept them breathing. That loyalty, that unshakable trust from the soldiers who mattered most, became the Admiral's obsession. He couldn't understand how they could respect me more than they feared him. He couldn't comprehend that leadership earned through confidence and care runs deeper than authority imposed through rank and intimidation. Every salute they gave me felt like rebellion to him. Every moment of trust between us felt like treason against his absolute control. So he decided to destroy what he couldn't dominate. If he couldn't break my spirit privately, he would shatter it publicly. If he couldn't discredit my abilities quietly, he would humiliate me loud enough for everyone to hear. Training field, mid-morning. The sun was already blazing overhead, turning the asphalt into a furnace and our uniforms into ovens. Hundreds of soldiers stood in perfect formation, new recruits, seasoned veterans, officers from every branch represented on the base. It was supposed to be a routine inspection, a standard display of military precision and discipline. I should have known something was wrong when I saw the microphone set up, when I noticed the cameras positioned at strategic angles, when I felt the unusual tension crackling through the ranks like electricity before a storm. But I walked onto that field with the same pride I'd carried for 7 years, the same confidence that had earned me every commendation pinned to my chest. Admiral Cole's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Strip her of that rank and take her badge off now. She can't coexist with me here. No one moved at first. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. It felt like time itself froze, like the Navy was holding its breath to see if I'd break, to see if the humiliation would crack the foundation of everything I'd built. Every eye was on me. Every camera lens focused on my face, waiting for tears, for protest, for the kind of emotional collapse that would justify his words. The heat of their stare felt worse than the sun beating down on us. These were soldiers I'd led, recruits I'd trained, officers I'd served alongside. And now they were watching my professional execution in real time. The weight of that moment pressed down on my shoulders like the ocean itself. 7 years of service, of dedication, of sacrifice, reduced to a public spectacle designed to break my spirit and warn others what happened when you threatened his authority. The medals on my chest felt like molten lead, each one a reminder of missions accomplished, lives saved, duties fulfilled with honor. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me shatter. Instead, I straightened my spine, looked him directly in the eyes, and saluted. One final acknowledgement of the rank he was stripping away, one last gesture of the discipline he couldn't destroy even as he destroyed me. Then I turned and walked off that field with every ounce of dignity I could summon. Behind me, I heard the whispers starting: confusion, shock, disbelief that such a public humiliation could happen to someone with my record. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every step of my retreat, every angle of my disgrace. As I walked away, I whispered to myself, let him roar. Tomorrow, his silence will be louder. Returning to my quarters felt like entering a tomb. The space that had been my sanctuary for 3 years suddenly felt hollow, stripped of meaning just like my rank had been stripped from my uniform. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs from successful missions, letters of appreciation from families of soldiers whose lives I'd helped save. All of it felt like evidence from someone else's life now. I packed slowly, methodically, like I was performing one final military exercise. Every stripe I folded felt like a piece of my dignity slipping away. Every medal I wrapped in tissue paper felt like I was burying a part of myself. The uniform that had given me purpose, identity, belonging, it was just fabric now, just cotton and polyester that would hang in some closet like a costume from a play that had ended. The base lights twinkled outside my window, the same lights I'd once been responsible for protecting, the same perimeter I'd helped secure against threats both foreign and domestic. Those lights represented thousands of people who depended on military personnel like me to keep them safe while they slept. And now I was being cast out of that sacred trust because one man's ego couldn't tolerate my competence. I sat by that window for hours, watching the guards make their rounds, seeing the ordinary rhythm of base life continue as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The Admiral's roar that morning had shifted the balance of power, created ripples that would spread far beyond what he imagined. At midnight, a soft knock interrupted my vigil. I opened the door to find a young courier standing in the hallway, his face carefully neutral, his posture military straight. He handed me 2 envelopes without a word, one stamped confidential, the other marked immediate command review. I didn't open them immediately. I just held them in my hands, feeling their weight, sensing the gravity of whatever words were sealed inside. The same system that had just silenced me publicly had sent these letters privately. And something in the courier's eyes, a flash of what might have been respect, or solidarity, or hope, told me that the night's silence might be pregnant with tomorrow's justice. The same system that once silenced me had finally spoken, and it had chosen a side. I spent the rest of that night staring at those unopened envelopes, running my fingers along their edges, feeling the official seals beneath my thumbs. Part of me was afraid to open them, afraid to discover that they contained more humiliation, more punishment, more evidence that my career was truly over. But another part of me, the part that had survived 7 years of military service, that had faced enemy fire and impossible odds, that part whispered that sometimes justice moves quietly, without fanfare, without the theatrical rage that marked its opposite. Morning came with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes everything look possible. I made coffee with steady hands, dressed in civilian clothes that felt strange against my skin, and finally opened the first letter. "Commander, please read the Admiral's dismissal notice." My hands shook as I unfolded the document, official seal of Pacific Command pressed into heavy paper, words typed in the formal language of military justice. Admiral Cole had been suspended pending disciplinary review for abuse of authority, public misconduct, and violation of command protocols. The very system he thought he controlled had been watching, measuring, weighing his actions against the standards he claimed to represent. The investigation had been swift and thorough. Testimonies from officers who had witnessed his gradual campaign against me, records of the missions where my tactical input had been proven correct, documentation of his personal vendetta disguised as command decisions. Everything had been laid bare under the scrutiny of superior officers who understood that leadership required more than volume and intimidation. The second letter carried words that made my breath catch in my throat. Effective immediately, Commander Eva Martinez is to assume acting command until further notice. I dropped both letters on my desk and whispered, "Justice doesn't shout. It signs." The poetic vindication of that moment was almost overwhelming. Not loud revenge, not dramatic confrontation, just the quiet restoration of order through proper channels. The same authority that Admiral Cole had wielded like a weapon had now turned that weapon against him. His public humiliation of me had become evidence of his unfitness to lead. 20 minutes later, he stormed into the office that was now mine. His face was red with fury, his phone clutched in his white-knuckled grip like evidence of some terrible mistake that needed to be corrected. The man who had thundered my disgrace across a training field now looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own rage. "Commander, what is the meaning of this?" "I've been ordered to report to you." I stayed seated behind the desk, the same desk he had ruled from just 24 hours earlier. The symmetry of the moment was not lost on me. Power had simply changed hands, authority had been reassigned, and the natural order had been restored through official channels rather than personal vendettas. "Take a seat, Admiral. We have orders to review." He froze. The word Admiral coming from my lips carried a different weight now, not subordinate addressing superior, but commanding officer acknowledging a former rank. His pride cracked audibly in the silence that followed. The same heavy quiet he had once weaponized against me now pressed down on his shoulders like judgment itself. I handed him his dismissal letter, watching his eyes move across the words that ended his career. He stumbled over the formal language. "You are hereby relieved of your command effective immediately pending investigation into violations of military conduct and abuse of authority." Each word landed like a physical blow. The man who had built his identity around absolute control was discovering that no one's control is truly absolute. The system he had tried to manipulate had its own mechanisms for correction, its own ways of protecting the institution from those who would corrupt it for personal gain. I leaned back in the chair and added softly, "You told me we couldn't coexist on this base, Admiral. You were right." The power reversal was complete but not vindictive. I felt no pleasure in his humiliation, no satisfaction in his downfall. Instead, I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders, the duty to rebuild what his personal vendetta had damaged, to restore trust in leadership that served the mission rather than feeding the ego. He left the base in silence that afternoon. No ceremony, no formal farewell, just a quiet exit that contrasted sharply with the public spectacle he had created for my demotion. Soldiers saluted me as I walked through the same ground of my humiliation, but their salutes felt different now, not just acknowledgement of rank, but recognition of justice served and order restored. The field that once buried my pride had now become my parade ground. That evening brought confirmation from command, permanent reinstatement, with full honors restored and a notation in my record that the previous day's action had been reversed due to command misconduct. My service record would reflect the truth rather than one man's distorted version of it. I didn't smile when I read that confirmation. I just exhaled slowly and whispered, "Justice doesn't scream. It breathes." The restoration felt less like victory and more like returning home after a long, difficult journey. My rank hadn't just been given back, it had been validated by a system that proved it could correct its own mistakes when leadership failed to meet the standards it demanded from others. The next morning, I addressed my unit for the first time as their official commanding officer. These soldiers had stood by me through the darkest hours, had maintained their loyalty and respect even when it might have cost them advancement under the previous command structure. They deserved leadership that honored their sacrifice and dedication. If anyone ever tries to define your worth by their rank, I told them, let your integrity define their end. We serve something greater than any individual ego. We serve the mission, we serve each other, and we serve the principles that make this uniform meaningful. I began the work of re-establishing command culture built on merit rather than fear, on competence rather than politics, on mutual respect rather than enforced submission. The toxic atmosphere that had developed under Admiral Cole's personal vendetta would be replaced by an environment where soldiers could focus on their duties rather than navigating interpersonal landmines. The symbolic moment came when I pinned my badge back onto my uniform, not as revenge against the man who had stripped it away, but as restoration of the natural order. The weight of that badge felt different now, heavier with responsibility, but lighter with the knowledge that it had been earned through trials that tested not just my capabilities, but my character. He stripped me of my badge. But the next day I read his dismissal letter. That's not revenge, that's rhythm. The rhythm of justice. The weeks that followed brought challenges that had nothing to do with personal vendettas and everything to do with real military concerns. Training schedules needed refinement, strategic planning required attention, and the unit needed to rebuild confidence that had been shaken by months of political maneuvering disguised as command decisions. But there was something purifying about focusing on actual military objectives rather than defending against internal threats. My soldiers responded with the kind of dedication and excellence that had always been possible when leadership created space for competence to flourish rather than demanding submission to incompetence. The investigation into Admiral Cole's conduct revealed a pattern that extended far beyond his treatment of me. Other officers came forward with similar stories of intimidation, professional sabotage, and personal vendettas disguised as command decisions. The toxic leadership style that had targeted me had poisoned the entire command structure, creating an atmosphere where advancement depended more on personal loyalty than professional competence. His removal wasn't just about one incident of public humiliation. It was about systemic correction of leadership that had forgotten its primary obligation to serve the mission rather than feed personal ego. The investigation served as a reminder that military discipline works both ways, that those who demand high standards from subordinates must meet even higher standards themselves. I found myself thinking about the nature of justice in those quiet moments between operational demands. True justice isn't dramatic or spectacular. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. Instead, it moves with the quiet efficiency of natural law, correcting imbalances through institutional mechanisms designed to protect the integrity of the system itself. Admiral Cole's downfall wasn't orchestrated by me or anyone else seeking revenge. It was the inevitable result of actions that violated the fundamental principles of military leadership. When authority is used as a weapon rather than a tool of service, the system has ways of protecting itself from those who would corrupt it. The soldiers under my command began to flourish in ways that had been impossible under the previous regime. Initiative was rewarded rather than punished, competence was recognized rather than threatened, and the natural hierarchy of merit could function without interference from personal politics. Training exercises became more effective when participants could focus on tactical objectives rather than navigating the emotional landmines of a commanding officer whose ego demanded constant validation. Mission planning improved when all expertise was welcome rather than filtered through the lens of personal loyalty. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Real change rarely is. But gradually, steadily, the unit began to operate with the kind of precision and cohesion that had always been possible when leadership served the mission rather than demanding that the mission serve personal interests. My relationship with the soldiers evolved as well. The shared experience of surviving toxic leadership had created bonds that went beyond normal command structure. They had seen me humiliated and had chosen to maintain their respect and loyalty. That choice created mutual trust that couldn't be manufactured through rank alone. Evening reports became collaborative sessions where input was welcomed from all levels of experience. Training schedules reflected the wisdom of veteran soldiers as well as the innovative thinking of newer recruits. The artificial barriers that had been erected to protect one man's ego were dismantled, allowing natural leadership to emerge at every level of the command structure. There were moments during those reconstruction weeks when I caught myself thinking about Admiral Cole. Not with anger or satisfaction at his downfall, but with something closer to sadness for the waste of it all. He had been a capable officer once, had served his country with distinction before his need for absolute control corrupted his judgment and poisoned his relationships with subordinates. The tragedy wasn't just his personal downfall, it was the damage done to soldiers who had been caught in the crossfire of his personal insecurities. Careers had been stunted, talent had been wasted, and trust in leadership had been eroded by his inability to distinguish between authority and authoritarianism. But institutions have ways of healing from such wounds when toxic elements are removed and healthy leadership is restored. The same soldiers who had been diminished under his command began to flourish when given space to demonstrate their capabilities without fear of political consequences. Letters began arriving from other bases where similar situations had been identified and corrected. The investigation into Admiral Cole's conduct had rippled outward, creating accountability for leadership throughout the command structure. Other officers who had operated with similar disregard for proper authority found themselves facing scrutiny that had long been overdue. The military's capacity for self-correction was reassuring to witness. While individual leaders might become corrupted by power or consumed by personal ego, the institutional framework remained strong enough to identify and remove such toxicity when it threatened the mission or the people who served it. Training new officers became particularly meaningful during this period. I could share not just tactical knowledge, but wisdom about the proper use of authority, the difference between leadership and domination, the importance of serving something greater than personal ambition. These young officers would inherit command responsibilities in an environment that had been cleansed of the toxic patterns that had nearly destroyed my own career. They would learn to lead through competence and character rather than fear and intimidation. The most profound change was in how I understood my own relationship to authority. Having experienced its abuse firsthand, I became more conscious of how power could corrupt even well-intentioned leaders. Every decision I made was filtered through awareness of how authority could be used to serve or to harm. Command became a sacred trust rather than a personal privilege. The rank I wore represented obligations to subordinates, to superiors, to the mission, and to the principles that made military service meaningful. It was never again just about my own advancement or recognition. The badge that had been stripped away in public humiliation and restored through institutional justice carried weight that went beyond its metal and fabric. It represented the system's capacity to protect what mattered most, not individual careers or personal egos, but the integrity of service itself. Months passed before I received any word about Admiral Cole's final disposition. He had been quietly transferred to a desk position far from operational command. His career effectively ended, though not technically terminated. The military had dealt with him the way it dealt with all threats to institutional integrity, swiftly, thoroughly, but without unnecessary drama. His removal created space for leaders who understood that authority was earned through service rather than demanded through intimidation. The toxic culture he had created was gradually replaced by an environment where excellence could flourish without political interference. The investigation's final report noted that his treatment of me had been part of a broader pattern of leadership failures that threatened unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. My public humiliation had been the visible symptom of systematic abuse that required institutional correction rather than individual tolerance. Reading that report, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because the truth had been recognized and recorded officially. Sadness because so much damage could have been prevented if earlier warning signs had been taken seriously by those with authority to act. But the military, like any large institution, sometimes requires dramatic failures to catalyze necessary changes. My public humiliation had become the catalyst for reforms that would protect other soldiers from similar abuse in the future. Years later, when new officers asked about leadership principles, I would tell them this story. Not as a tale of personal triumph, but as an illustration of how institutional integrity ultimately protects those who serve it faithfully. Systems are stronger than individuals when those systems remain committed to their founding principles. The lesson wasn't that good always triumphs over evil in dramatic fashion. The lesson was that consistent commitment to principle eventually creates accountability for those who abuse authority. Justice moves slowly but inexorably, like water finding its way downhill. My career continued and flourished in an environment cleansed of the toxicity that had nearly destroyed it. Promotions came based on merit rather than political maneuvering. Assignments reflected competence rather than personal connections. The natural order of military hierarchy functioned as it was designed to function. But I never forgot the lesson of that training field, of that public humiliation that had seemed like an ending but became a beginning. Power that serves itself is ultimately powerless against truth that serves something greater. He demoted me publicly, but the next day, I was reading his dismissal notice. Remember this, humiliation can echo, but justice answers louder. Power can silence truth for a while, but it can never silence destiny. When authority forgets its purpose, the system has ways of remembering for it. The rhythm of justice may be slow, but it is relentless. It moves through institutional channels designed to protect what matters most, not individual careers or personal egos, but the integrity of service itself. And when that rhythm finally sounds, it drowns out all the noise that came before it.